spend too much time worrying about the business model around the delivery mechanism rather than the thing it's actually delivering.
It's not just, are we producing good shows here? Of course we are. There are wonderful shows here. But there isn't the excitement around it. There isn't a feeling that creativity is somehow centering around the BBC and what it produces. As a novelist, I don't feel the BBC is, I don't look and say, oh, but if only I were writing for the BBC instead. And I should.
I'm a musician, a pop musician, and I grew up listening to music mostly on the radio, and in fact mostly on the BBC. So I have a huge debt to the BBC in that respect, because we still have a more democratic culture of music in England than in almost any other country. And I think if you look at a culture as an ecology of ideas passing around, then you realize that this very healthy ecology we have here for pop culture, mass culture in general, is very much aided by the medium of the BBC, which makes it possible for people who really come from absolutely nowhere to be heard by quite a few 100,000 or even million people. If you listen to Radio 6, for example, I would say a good 20% of the material they broadcast is, by any stretch of the definition, quite obscure. And that's really rather amazing that a national radio station is doing something that happens in a very small way in other countries.
The role of the BBC is to guarantee access to art and culture and stories. And without the guarantee of access, the stories themselves are dead. In the case of a railway, it relies upon two things, trains and tracks, and these are not chicken and egg. The train is absolutely useless without the tracks. The tracks aren't that useful without the train, I accept, but at least the tracks go somewhere and are waiting for trains to be built onto them. And the most important thing the BBC can do is guarantee tracks and guarantee access to the tracks and put wonderful trains on them, of course, but also make it possible for other people to put wonderful trains on them.
Because the BBC is only peripherally a media organisation, despite the fact it spends most of its money on it, it is fundamentally a technology organisation. In its long history, its 90-year history, the BBC has had two enormous successes in the field of technology. You might have heard of them, they're called radio and television. And it's working on a third, which is how to do online, but has wasted the last 15 years. Instead of building its own tools and systems and technologies, the BBC has cobbled together solutions based around other people's technologies, like the World Wide Web. And we see that most clearly in iPlayer, where what's novel about iPlayer is the way the components are plugged together and the environment within which it is made available, but iPlayer is not itself innovative. All it is a way for television people to make television visible on other screens that are not television.
You need nimbleness. You need more with the rank and file. You need to expand the structures. You need to expand the kinds of people who are involved with creativity. Who gets to decide? Who commissions? When an institution comes under financial pressure, the tendency is to move away from risk-taking. The tendency for the executives is to move away from risk-taking into the shadows of safety, which is where creativity goes to die.
It's a bizarre thing that the biggest single centre of creativity in terms of television production in this country only makes for one broadcaster. Why? I just don't know of any producers who wake up 8 o'clock in the morning, in my case 3 o'clock in the morning, and say, I've got a great idea for the BBC.
Nobody would expect Radio 1 to go making records. They play records that people have made. So one of the reasons that pop music has been so lively is because there hasn't been the same kind of bottleneck as you described exists in television. There aren't bottlenecks on what people make, because it's very, very cheap to make records. It always has been relatively cheap. It's really cheap now. Yeah. But that means that you have radio stations, which we all know are places that play things that people have made themselves and generally paid for themselves, or in a relationship with a record company. So I'm sure in the future there'll be a sort of big hole, actually, where for that function that television companies, or the BBC in particular, has historically held, of being the commissioner and the sort of, in a sense, the arbiter of taste, will disappear in a way. Yeah. So they've got to start thinking of something else to do with with all their time and good intentions.
But isn't this what you said earlier, Brian, about the ecosystem?
Yeah.
The environment within which all creative expression takes place is shifting. And it's not clear like which predators are going to survive, which species are going to thrive. And this creates new opportunities. I think sort of you're right to say that the traditional television commissioning model is in the UK, very rigid. But it's now not the only way to get something on a screen in front of an audience.